From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
Talks hit a roadblock. GOP negotiators walk out of negotiations over the debt ceiling earlier this morning, saying the White House is not being reasonable.
Ukrainian President Zelensky heads to the G7 meeting in Japan after attending a gathering of Arab leaders in Saudi Arabia. Our own Anne-Marie Hordern is in Hiroshima with the latest in an interview with U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel.
And add another name to the official list of who is running for president. Senator Tim Scott files the paperwork ahead of a big event next week. We'll break it all down with our political panel.
What a difference a day makes. Here's Speaker McCarthy yesterday, Kaylee, on Capitol Hill. Listen.
Where we were a week ago and where we are today is a much better place because we've got the right people in the room discussing it in a very professional manner.
And then this morning, a change of tune.
Well, we've got to get movement by the White House, and we don't have any movement yet. So, yeah, we got to pause.
So, what happened? Joining us around the table, Bloomberg's Megan Scully and national security reporter Nick Wadhams with a lot to talk about on a day, Kaylee, we're balancing a number of different stories here, a number of breaking stories. And Megan, I'm going to start with you on the debt ceiling because, boy, we thought we were onto something yesterday. So did the markets, by the way. It was nothing but optimism, confidence, progress. And today, Republican negotiators walked out of the negotiating session on Capitol Hill. What does that mean?
You know, they walked out after about an hour of negotiations, saying essentially that they had to put the talks on pause, that the White House was being unreasonable. We see this a lot in negotiations on the Hill. You know, it's no, yes. Okay. And although yesterday we had a little bit of early yes, I guess, from the speaker. You know, I think that there was a lot of disappointment today that they didn't come to some sort of an agreement because of McCarthy's optimism yesterday. But they still have a lot to work out in terms of spending caps and perhaps most importantly in terms of getting the left and right flanks in line.
But, Megan, it wasn't even just that McCarthy was sounding optimistic yesterday. He was laying out a timetable. He thought we could have a deal in principle by the end of this weekend and that this thing could be on the House floor by next week. So it raises the question of the timeline here. I understand that a lot of this is just, you know, this is how negotiations work. Each one wants to act tough. We're looking, of course, here at Congressman Garrett Graves, who is leading the negotiations on McCarthy's behalf, walking out here. And I have to wonder if they feel like they still have time to get a deal done. Sure. To get a deal through Congress, though, I feel like is the hang-up. I mean, we're talking about a Congress that needed 15 rounds to even make Kevin McCarthy speaker. Like, it feels like there's a pretty decent margin for error here.
Yes, there definitely is. You know, you can get legislation through the House if you know you have the support pretty quickly. They have rules in place where they can speed things through without an amendment. Where things get held up is in the Senate. And any one senator can object to bringing a bill to the floor, and then that can gum things up for 30 hours, and then there can be more motions like that. So getting it through the Senate will take a few days if they can't all agree on an expedited passage, and it is getting close to June 1st.
There's been a lot of negotiating through the media, whether it's here on Bloomberg or on Twitter. I realize that's part of it. Theatrics are also part of this, as everyone seemed to be getting along maybe too well, I guess, for the Republican team to feel like they were getting what they wanted out of this. But what's the reality? Because we are still as close to a deal today as we were yesterday.
I think so. You know, one thing we noticed yesterday was we saw that the two, you know, the liberals and the diehard conservatives came out with their concerns and were very against certain aspects of the emerging deal. That usually signalizes that we're getting closer to a deal. Right. You know, when people get upset, when it goes beyond being just something notional. So I do think we are moving in that direction still. You mentioned theatrics, and that is certainly part of this. This is politics, and they need to pacify their restive bases, both sides.
Well, and to the point that this is politics, we have to note the timing of when these headlines were crossing. It was the middle of the night, basically, in Japan, where the president is at the moment. I would imagine, Nick, that he was probably sleeping. I don't know if someone woke him up, but certainly he's going to have to wake up to the news at some point, because this was literally the middle of the night. He's at the G7 meeting. This has to color his day today.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge deal for the president. As Megan was saying, he has so much momentum going into it because, this G7 meeting is really about, hey, listen, countries around the world side with the United States. Look at us. Look to our model rather than the Chinese model. And something like this, if he can't zip this up while he's at this major event, I mean, the G7 really kicks into gear this weekend. This is when they're going to do all the big meetings, all the big statements and pronouncements. And, if Joe Biden can't even get a handle on the U.S. budget back home, I mean, for us, this is something that's happened a lot. But for other countries, a deep feeling of unease about the, stability of the U.S. going forward. Still
quite a bit of news coming out of this G7 today, Nick. We talked about it earlier, specifically with regard to Ukraine, as the president kind of unlocks the idea of European allies providing F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine and President Zelensky showing up in person. How much did that have to do with the president changing his tune here?
Well, I mean, it's just been a seesawing couple of days, not only back here in the U.S., but, for months the U.S. had insisted we are not going to give F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. And then suddenly Biden comes out with this statement today saying, hey, we're going to allow European countries to train Ukrainian pilots on on F-16 fighter jets, U.S.-made fighter jets. And with the possibility of Ukraine getting fighter jets at some point in the future. I mean, it's just like this is something the U.S. had been telling us for months. There is absolutely no way this is going to happen. Right. We have seen this before with successively more and more powerful weapon systems, so it's a pattern that is looking increasingly familiar. But, certainly you can make the contrast between what's happening at home with Joe Biden and then what's happening in Japan, where he's really shoring up those allies and getting the allies behind the United States.
Well, and is this another instance of it being no?
It really is.
It is.
Yes,
it's
right?
Exactly right.
It's kind of a similar pattern. But talking about how this plays at home, Megan, does he have the backing of Congress still on this issue, on the support for Ukraine? Because we had a lot of questions about that when it became a Republican House, whether or not that kind of resolve internally in the U.S. was going to start to deteriorate.
So I think you saw McCarthy a few weeks ago when he was traveling abroad, and he answered a question from a Russian reporter, and I think surprised a lot of people with his sort of hard support for Ukraine. Shortly after that, you saw, we had a sit-down interview with Leader McConnell, who has long supported very healthy aid packages to Ukraine, and he came out behind it. Of course, you have the sort of the outer tier of the Republican Party who have said, we need to stop this, no more money for Ukraine. But I don't think that is becoming a mainstream foundation within the Republican Party.
We talk about timing here, Nick. There's also the question of timing around a spring offensive, and I wonder if that played into this decision.
Well, it's really interesting because the F-16 decision signals something different, which gets to what Megan is talking about funding. It's more of a long-term commitment because the pilots who are training on these aircraft are going to need months and months, 6 months, maybe even up to a year. The offensive could happen really any day now. So what this looks like from some of us looking at this is, hey, President Biden is basically saying, sure, F-16s, that is signaling an allied commitment well into the long term. It's also responding to pressure from some of these Republicans. Megan was talking to Mitch McConnell, who had been pressing for the F-16. And what's going to happen next, of course, is President Biden's going to say, hey, you want F-16s, we're willing to give those to Ukraine. Now you got to pay up. That's going to cost money. So it looks like he's steering both Republicans and allies into a situation where we get a long-term commitment and more funding for Ukraine.
And that commitment of the allies and the unification of the allies really has stayed pretty remarkably consistent. Can the same be said, though, on the approach to China? Because that's the other issue looming large at the G7.
Right. I mean, yes, there is a fair amount of allied support, but it's really not the G7 that people need to be worried about when it comes to China. It's really all the countries around in Asia and the rest of the world. India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, a lot of these countries that don't want to pick a side. And then you have U.S. partners like Vietnam, for example, where they say, listen, you guys got to chill out. You guys got to make nice with China because we do not want to be caught in the middle of something here. So what you're seeing is, yes, keep the allies on side at the G7, present this sort of appealing alternative to China. But listen, we do not want this to become an open conflict because that's going to make a lot of these other countries very uneasy.
All right. Well, it's going to continue over the weekend, these conversations. Thank you both so much for joining us. We'll let you go have your weekends now, Megan Scully and Nick Wadhams. We appreciate your time. And coming up, Bloomberg spoke with U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, at the G7 meeting about countering China and what comes next for the U.S.-Pacific relationship. We'll have more of that conversation next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. As we've been discussing, world leaders are gathering in Japan for the G7 summit. And joining us now from there in Hiroshima is Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern. So, Anne-Marie, it's a G7 meeting, yes, but also it's about to become a Quad meeting because the president's not going to Australia, so it has to happen there.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The president is going to be meeting with other leaders, part of the Quad, because he had to scrap this trip. He was planning to Australia to have this Quad meeting. The White House did in their readout announcing this meeting on the sidelines of the G7 that will be taking place today in Japan. It is Saturday. Good morning from Hiroshima. The president said that they were very welcoming of the flexibility these leaders were able to give. So you have the Prime Minister of India here, obviously the Japanese Prime Minister, of course, the United States, and Prime Minister Albanese of Australia, all meeting on the sidelines. They don't mention China by name, but that is clearly the biggest risk that is facing this group. They want to talk about infrastructure, supply chains, submarine cables. And this is something I spoke to Ambassador Rahm Emanuel yesterday about. He talked about the fact that at this G7, it is not about just words and communiques when it comes to what he is calling China's economic coercion. And he pointed to the Micron deal that was being done on the sidelines of the G7 about more that we could probably expect coming out of this region. Take a listen.
Japan is what I refer to as the supply chain of the supply chain. There are about 18, 19 companies here in Japan that operate 40 to 75 to 80% of market share worldwide in their space. You cannot produce a semiconductor without a Japanese company involved in it, if not multiple companies. Getting the next generation memory chip, produce 1 gamma with EUV here outside of Taiwan is going to secure the supply chain. It's a strategic asset for memory chips that are now going up in quality towards logic. But also, which wasn't the original purpose, then you add a layer on top. When China switched their and focused on Micron, it has a component of an anti-coercion initiative. It's interesting, China, after years of practicing coercion against Japan, Korea, Philippines, Lithuania, Australia, has now focused from coercion against countries to coercion against companies. Micron is a kind of a target of that. So the initiative was to produce secure 1 gamma memory chip, has a layer of international component of confronting China's coercion and saying that America and Japan will act in unison to help and secure our supply chain and help companies that are targeted by China's coercion.
Right, so China's looking into Micron right now, saying they have charges on cybersecurity.
Not deep ice, but I mean, they're trying to, like they did with Mintz Consulting, like they've done with Bain, they are sending a very singular message that they will coerce companies to try to break the Western world when it comes to securing their own not only strategic assets like a semiconductor, but also to try to do certain things to force a political change.
Well, they are clearly forcing some change when it comes to Micron setting up this.
Yes, it's going to be this. There will be only 3 of these factories worldwide: 2 in Taiwan, 1 now in Japan.
I also want to ask you about, you put out this tweet saying there's going to be more than just words in this communique. There's going to be action when it comes to economic coercion. So this Micron deal is potentially one the president will point to. But what else can we see out of the G7?
Yeah. Well, you got to there's a collection of things. One is a couple months ago, the EU passed a major significant step on fighting coercion, targeting. In that case, it was lessons learned out of what happened to Lithuania when they had the audacity to say something about Taiwan that China didn't like. So there was a specific action the EU took already. They have an entire strategy related to coercion. I know in the Congress of the United States, both in the House and the Senate, Senator Young and Coons in the Senate, there's Chairman McCall, Tom Cole, Ami Bera, Greg Meeks, who also have a bill there. They're going to start to work. I know there's been a couple hearings and now start to draft legislation. They have draft legislation, but to move it to fight and not only and to confront China's coercion, because one of the key pieces is having unified collective action. We have been successful across the board in confronting China when they dealt with Australia, Japan, or Korea, or the Philippines, but it has been ad hoc. Now we need a collaboration, a coordinated strategy in a unified way to confront it. And so those are a series of pieces, and then specifically the communique will talk about it, but Micron's your first example of coming to the aid of a country that will also produce a key memory chip that also has been targeted by China, and I think it sets a precedent. China has actively, since 2012, tied almost specifically to President Xi, has actively pursued a strategy of economic coercion. They have done it to a number of countries over the years. There's lessons to be learned. They're now doing it to companies. They also have acted through One Belt, One Roads. They've created massive economic and political difficulties for the Sri Lankas, the Pakistans, the Zambias. They have actively engaged in a type of intellectual property theft. At some point, all of us who believe in the system, and China says they want to be part of a system internationally, they have to act like a responsible party. They can't keep stealing, can't keep breaking other countries' will to have their own political views. That is not how this works.
U.S. Ambassador to Japan Rahm Emanuel speaking with Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern in Japan. And Anne-Marie is with us now again from Hiroshima. It's really a fascinating conversation that's happening there right now, Anne-Marie, with China looming large over this G7 and a lot of talk, and in fact, even some deal making, if we can call it that, about Ukraine. And President Volodymyr Zelensky is, in fact, there in person now. How important is that visit, and what is it doing to the conversation? What should we expect from these meetings?
This is certainly one of President Volodymyr Zelensky's highest profile trips he's made since Putin began his invasion of Ukraine. And this is a story Jenny Leonard and I broke yesterday. And it's not just about coming to Hiroshima here to address G7 leaders. He was also in the Middle East attending the Arab League summit on the heels of him visiting a number of European capitals. So his message is really ahead of this counter-offensive to make sure that he's still getting the support of the international community. The biggest takeaway from his trip when he lands here in Hiroshima is, of course, going to be the President of the United States going to be giving this backing of Ukrainian pilots to be trained on F-16s. Now, Biden is stopping short of actually sending the jets, but it is an important move forward because pilots cannot be trained on F-16 jets without the U.S. permission, given the fact that these are American-made. And we could potentially see in the next few weeks that program starting to take place in Europe. So for Zelensky, who's really been pushing about these jets, this is a massive step forward for him to potentially get that win.
Recalling our conversation with Yuri Sok here in Washington, Anne-Marie, it's a remarkable evolution we've seen over the last month following that ask from Ukraine, and the answer is getting a lot closer to yes. Anne-Marie, thank you so much for the reporting today. Coming up, we'll take a deep dive into the details of some of the sticking points on the debt limit debate with Bloomberg's Jack Fitzpatrick. That's coming up next on Balance of Power.
Republicans like to talk about the deficit.
We need to have some level of spending caps.
We got to see some cuts along with that.
Reasonable spending cuts.
Claw back COVID funds that are unspent.
The claw back of unspent COVID funds.
Clawing back of those COVID dollars.
We'd like to open up our energy a little bit more.
Some common sense reforms.
Those were some congressional Republicans we've spoken to recently on what they want out of a debt deal. But we've also spoken with Democrats who have been pretty clear about what they don't.
Any work requirements are a deal breaker.
I would not want work requirements in it. I don't think they will be in it. I don't think that's going to be that particular thing is compromisable.
We're not going to do stricter work requirements, and I'm not going to vote for it.
I cannot support a deal that is only about hurting people.
So here with more detail on some of these particular issues is Bloomberg Government's Jack Fitzpatrick. So, Jack, let's actually talk specifically about spending caps, because we've talked about it in broad strokes. But when we get down to the nitty-gritty, really, what are we looking at?
Well, they have to mathematically meet somewhere in the middle, probably. This is the core of the Republican proposal, is seeking $130 billion in spending cuts. The details don't have to be written into this bill. It would cap spending, and then later when you have to fund the government, you got to figure out the details. Plus some COVID rescissions, although there's been some indication from Republican leadership that maybe that could count toward the spending cuts. So there are a couple different ways to get there. They meanwhile are putting out their government funding bills. Republicans saying, well, we're not going to cut veterans, we're not going to cut defense. But really, fundamentally, it's not terribly complicated if they're all trying to meet in the middle. It's not quite going to be the $130 billion in cuts and then limits on growth from there. But it's a question of how many cuts Democrats can accept and then how they divide it between defense and non-defense, which could lose you hawkish votes on the Republican side. But they really, it's not terribly complicated to find a middle ground number less than $130 billion.
All right, so this is why people hate Washington. How much of this is show business, posturing for their own caucuses, sort of cheering or jeering from the sidelines?
Probably a lot. You're hearing a lot from the left and right wing. You're hearing from the House Freedom Caucus members who put out a statement, kind of walked it back later, but put out a statement saying the Senate should just vote on the House bill, the House Republican bill. The Progressive Caucus has 66 members that signed on to a letter just this afternoon saying the president should prepare to use the 14th Amendment. Some Senate progressives are saying that too. That still leaves a lot of middle ground. How many Democratic votes do they rely on in the House? How many votes from either side do they get in the Senate? It's hard to say, but you can see dozens on the right wing and dozens on the left wing, making it clear it's going to be very difficult to get their votes.
The center caucuses here, I suspect, will carry the day, Kayleigh. But I don't know. You wonder if maybe we're close enough to a deal that they feel like they've got the time to spend on theatrics.
Yeah, but the whip count, Joe, I don't know if anyone has a real sense of what it looks like, including those negotiating this deal.
Fair enough. Coming up, Ukrainian President Zelensky at the G7 summit following a meeting with Arab nations in Saudi Arabia. What does it mean for the U.S. military? Leon Panetta is with us next. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Thanks for joining us. The G7 underway in Japan, where President Biden is meeting with world leaders on a number of pressing issues, including the war in Ukraine. All the while, he's facing hurdles on the domestic front here as negotiations over the debt ceiling have stalled. And joining us now is someone who knows the executive wing quite well, having served as White House Chief of Staff to President Bill Clinton before he moved on to run the Pentagon and the CIA. We're pleased to welcome, as always, the Honorable Leon Panetta to the broadcast. Mr. Secretary, it's great to have you here. If my years are correct here, you're a true voice of experience on everything we're talking about here. You were Chief of Staff for the shutdown, the government shutdown under Speaker Gingrich. Then you were also fresh on the job as the Defense Secretary for the fiscal cliff that led to the sequester. You understand what it's like to be managing budgets in times like these. Is this history repeating itself?
Well, I'm afraid so. I often tell the students that I have here at the Panetta Institute that in a democracy, we govern either by leadership or crisis. If leadership is there, we can avoid crisis. But if it's not there, then we govern largely by crisis. And right now, we're largely governing by crisis, threatening to take the country off a cliff in order to deal with not only the debt limit, but also this huge budget debt that we have.
Yeah, and of course, while they're trying to negotiate a deal so that we don't go off the cliff, in theory, that deal is going to bring cuts or caps to government spending. And the current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, was testifying in a committee hearing earlier this week, saying reducing funding to 2022 levels across the government would hamstring our ability to compete, even if the Defense Department is exempted from cuts. Secretary Panetta, can you just give us some color as to what spending cuts would do to the U.S. and its ability to compete on the international level?
Well, obviously, this is a pretty critical time. We're living in a dangerous world. I don't think more needs to be said. We're confronting Russia with a war in Ukraine. We're dealing with China. We're dealing with the threat from North Korea, from Iran. We're dealing with cyber attacks. We're dealing with terrorism. So that this is a world that has a lot of flashpoints. And the United States right now is involved in most of those flashpoints, either providing weapons, as we are, to the Ukrainians in the war they're fighting, or in providing security assistance to our allies in order to be able to have some kind of collective security to deal with these other flashpoints. So it's a very critical time. And obviously, we're providing these weapons. We're digging into our own resources. We can't put ourselves at a disadvantage should we have to confront another crisis somewhere else in the world. And that's what you have to worry about with these cuts. It would be nice to have cuts basically designed to target areas where you can achieve savings. But in this situation, they're basically going to agree on some kind of formula that makes an across-the-board cut, and you're not quite sure how the hell that's going to be implemented.
Wow. Let's just to get a little bit deeper in the weapons that we are providing Ukraine. Mr. Secretary, there's news today from the G7 as President Biden warms up to this idea of giving Ukraine F-16s, maybe not American F-16s, but American-made F-16s from our European partners, green-lighting training for Ukrainian pilots. They've been asking for months to make this happen. Mr. Secretary, I wonder what you make of this pattern. We went through it with Abrams tanks. We went through it with a number of weapon systems, including defensive systems like the Patriot missile batteries, where the answer is first no, then there's more pressing, it becomes maybe, and then eventually yes. Why not just give everything Ukraine has been asking for now?
Well, there's no question it's been a ponderous process, that's for sure. But we seem to come out we seem to come out with the right conclusion, which is to ultimately provide these weapons. I think, frankly, there ought to be a better process of just basically saying we are going to provide the Ukrainians with the weapons they need in order to be able to win this war, period. And then try to move on each of these elements that make up the weapons that we are providing. I'm glad the president has come to the decision to allow them to have the F-16s. You know, the F-16, it's going to be a while before they get that capability. I'm sure it's going to be a while before they pick up some of these other weapon systems, but it makes a difference. The Brits provided something called the Storm Cloud missile, 150 miles. They are using it to go after Russian depots, Russian fuel depots, Russian ammo depots. They're going after Russian logistics. It's a 150-mile range on that missile. It is critical to their ability to be able to undermine the logistics that the Russians are going to need in order to be able to deal with what we anticipate will be a spring offensive here by Ukraine very soon.
And I'm sure Russia is watching this move and watching what leaders can accomplish at the G7 meeting. Secretary Panetta, I would imagine China is as well. What message does this send to Beijing?
Well, I've often said that the message that the United States and our allies in supporting Ukraine is not only sending a message to Russia, it's sending a very important message to China, to North Korea, and to Iran, which is that the United States and our allies, when they draw a line, are going to stick to it. And that, in effect, if China makes a bad decision with regards to Taiwan, they have a clear message as to what they will confront. So it's a great deterrence right now to be able to have a strong effort going on that will ultimately stop Putin in his invasion in Ukraine. It's not only good for democracy, I think it protects democracy in the 21st century.
Well, I'll tell you, there's a number of messages to the gentleman who's not in the room. Of course, that would be President Xi here with announcing an expanded trade partnership with Taiwan. I suspect that that goes even further to delivering that message. Mr. Secretary, what do you think?
Well, I don't think there's any question that trade agreement is critical. I think that the arms that we are providing, the weapons that we are providing to Ukraine is critical. She does not want to do anything, I don't believe, that will harm the economy of China. That is the one thing that she understands is critical to China's position in the world. And if we take actions and sanctions that undermine his economy, it will undermine his ability to have a strong China in the future. So she understands that. And so the real question now, because I understand the Russians are going to send someone else to China to talk to Xi, and I'm sure they're going to ask for some kind of military support. I think Xi has to be very careful not to suddenly engage in this war, because it would mean that his economy would be badly harmed.
As we talk about the tension between the United States and China, the combative relationship, I wonder if you could also talk to us about the strategic importance of Papua New Guinea, and if it was damaging that the president is cutting his trip short and will not be making a trip there.
Well, again, considering the message you send to China, I think the president's visit to New Guinea, the president's visit to New Zealand, basically sends a message that we care about our allies in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific area. And the one thing China does not like is our ability to pull our allies together. They don't like alliances. But alliances, frankly, are the key to our ability to be able to send a strong message to China, to have us operate from a position of strength. So it's not a good message, obviously, that President Biden couldn't make those other areas on his trip. But at the same time, the message that would be worse is to have us default on our economy and send that message to the world. So I understand why the president is doing what he's doing.
All right. And on that note, we will leave it. Thank you so much for your time today, sir. That's former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, current chairman of the Panetta Institute for Public Policy. We appreciate it. Now, coming up, we'll talk about the political ramifications of helping Ukraine with those military jets. Our political panel will be here to discuss. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
Now, keeping up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. I'm John Hyland. The U.S. and Taiwan have agreed to increase their trade relationship. It's the first tangible results from an initiative that faces opposition from China. The Taiwan Initiative isn't a formal free trade agreement, and it doesn't address thorny issues such as tariffs. Still, it clouds the outlook for a visit to the U.S. next week by a Chinese commerce official. Morgan Stanley's James Gorman plans to step down as chief executive sometime in the next year. Gorman, who has been CEO since 2010, transformed the bank after it nearly collapsed during the global financial crisis. He'll assume the role of executive chairman. No word yet who'll be his replacement. In January, Gorman said there were 3 finalists for the job. Changes may be coming to outdoor dining in New York City. New legislation backed by Mayor Eric Adams would see the outdoor dining sheds limited to the months of April through November and only allowed to operate through 10 a.m. through midnight. Since the start of the pandemic, more than 12,000 restaurants opted to take advantage of the Open Restaurants program, setting up tables and chairs on sidewalks and roadways. The legislation is expected to be passed by the New York City Council in June. And Instagram is planning to release a competitor to Twitter. Meta is currently testing a text-based app with celebrities and influencers, according to People Familiar. The app will be separate from Instagram, but will allow users to connect their same accounts. It's expected to debut as soon as June. Global news, 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Originals. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm John Hyland, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. With President Biden appearing to change course on the use of some military aircraft for Ukraine today, there is the question of how this is going to play politically. We're joined now by our political panel, Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. And Rick and Jeannie, we have decided we are not going to speak with you about the debt ceiling today because we've all done it enough.
This is a mercy play.
Yet we've talked a lot about how in the debt ceiling talks it's going to be no, 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 no until it's a yes. Rick, it feels like it's the same thing when it comes to weapons in Ukraine, whether it was the Abrams tanks, Patriot missile systems. Now when it comes to F-16s, you resist on the part of the U.S. and then you give in? Is this why?
Reminds me of so many of those girls I dated in college. No, it's true. I mean, in the sense that this administration has to say no 10 times before they say yes. And I'll be honest with you, everyone's waiting for them to say yes on these F-16s. Republicans and Democrats alike, hawks and doves, they want Zelensky to have what he needs to wage war against the Russians. And this has been on the table since day one, and now it finally looks like we're going to get some action on that.
I really feel like I want to follow up on that, Rick, but I'm not going to do it on television here. Look, when we're talking about fighter jets here, Jeannie, we have been through this a couple of times, and we know that the ask had been made here. They're going to start training pilots. We're not actually giving the jets yet, but yet another example of what is inevitable. I don't know where the fighter jets are going to come from. Maybe it's Poland or some of our other European allies. But at what point does this routine, this pattern, even Leon Panetta acknowledged it, start to look ridiculous?
You know, it's been going on a long time, and thank you for saving me from commenting on Rick's comment, which I'm giggling about still. It's been going on a long time. It does feel a little bit like a repeat over and over again. You know, I do think the administration can be criticized for that, but the reality is these are very, very tough decisions to make. And I do think in defense of the administration on this, they have handled the situation with the war in Ukraine, I think, far better than most people could have expected. They have united our allies. We were not united when the administration took over. So they have done, I think, a really good job. I, too, have been critical about what feels like, you know, Groundhog Day over and over again with this yes, no, yes, no. But the reality is these are tough decisions. It was a good day today that they did this, and hopefully we are able to move forward and Zelensky gets what he needs when he goes to the G7.
You know what? It's not easy, by the way, learning how to fly these jets.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. It's something it's something that I would never be capable of. But I do know how to fly in the back seat of an F-16. I want you all to know, as I was screaming for my life here. This is back in 2009 at Nellis Air Force Base, and this is how you get to 10,000 feet in just a couple of seconds. I don't know how I lived through that. I did. Rick, you'd be proud of me. I broke the sound barrier. I pulled 9 Gs, and I didn't pass out. I also did not keep my lunch. But this is serious business, all joking aside. Thanks to a couple of folks for that video. That brought back some memories today. This is serious stuff when you start getting in the cockpit of an F-16, and there's been great concern about this actually escalating the war, whether Vladimir Putin will target the transfer of those jets, something that we talked about earlier today on Bloomberg Radio. Is that a concern?
You know, look, I mean, the Ukrainians have MiG fighters, right? And
yeah.
They have basically the same range as an F-16.
Yes,
they're
right.
replacing them now. They're not as good. There's a bucket of bolts that fly in the sky compared to the great American craftsmanship of an F-16.
Indeed.
But it's not like there's a tactical difference between the two weapon systems. And so I don't get the argument that somehow we're going to create an unnecessary escalation of the war by actually giving them something that's a more effective piece of equipment than what they're already using in the same part of the theater war. I mean, look, you can make that argument for these longer range missiles. Secretary Panetta on your last section was just talking about these British cruise missiles that go 150 miles. Mm-hmm. That is an extension. And that happened without anybody really saying a word about it. And you'll notice Vladimir Putin's not complaining about it. So launch one in his direction and see how he feels.
Fair enough.
Well, and Jeannie, you mentioned that President Zelensky is going to be at the G7 in Japan. He is going to meet these leaders face to face. Maybe an ask like the jets is a lot more difficult to refuse when you are actually meeting him in person. What else needs to come tangible out of the G7 meeting, whether it is with Zelensky there or otherwise, for it to be a success? Or is just having all of those leaders there, doing the pictures together, being seen enough?
You know, I think we have already seen today, you know, it has been a very productive, at least so far, G7. And I think, to your point, Kayleigh, very tough to resist Vladimir Zelensky when he goes there face to face. And, you know, I think critically important that, you know, we don't often think about is at the G7 is not only the leaders in the G7, but also other leaders that Vladimir Zelensky hasn't had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with. I'm thinking about the leaders of India, Indonesia, and elsewhere who are also there, and he's going to have an opportunity to speak with them face to face as well. You cannot underestimate, and this is something Joe Biden has said over and over throughout his career, the impact of having those face to face meetings. And so I do think we've gotten a lot out already today. He will get more when he goes there, but this face-to-face opportunity is critically important for him to shore up the support he needs.
Great insights from our panel, Rick and Jeannie. And by the way, thanks to the Air Force Thunderbirds for the ride of a lifetime. It's looking like a big week next week in Republican politics. Coming up, we'll talk about it. South Carolina Senator Tim Scott filing paperwork to make it official today. And Governor Ron DeSantis expected to do the same. Rick and Jeannie are back with more. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
I will never back down in defense of the conservative values that make America exceptional. And that's why I'm announcing my exploratory committee for President of the United States.
That was part of South Carolina Senator Tim Scott's video announcement a couple weeks ago about the formation of his exploratory committee. Today, he makes it official. Rick Davis, Jeannie Shanzano back with us, our political panel, as we look ahead to 2024. Rick, there's been a lot of thought about what a Senator Scott candidacy might look like in the midst of this Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis battle that's going on now. Can he somehow find a lane between them?
Yeah, he can find a lane. The question is it overgrown with so much foliage that nobody notices he's in it?
Okay.
And that's the problem, because he's not the kind of guy that's going to go out and try and say something or do something extraordinary to try and get the attention onto him. So he's going to have a strategy to sort of building blocks, right? Start making friends in Iowa. Start making friends in New Hampshire. Don't expect to be on the front page of the New York Times. Don't expect to be up in the polling, you know, for the next year. You know, and he's going to have to be one of these campaigns that just gets traction late and is able to use that traction to try and catapult him into the top tier.
Well, and if you think about Ron DeSantis' point of view, Jeannie, he doesn't seem to think that Tim Scott is a real threat here, because he was quoted on a call with donors yesterday. You basically have three people at this point who are credible in this whole thing: Biden, Trump, and me. And I think of those three, two of us have a chance to get elected president, Biden and me, based on the data in the swing states, which is not great for the former president. But Jeannie, that's general election politics, not primary.
That's right. And, you know, I think in Ron DeSantis' defense, and that's not a phrase I say a lot, he is right when you look at the money. I mean, both he and Donald Trump have, you know, above $100 million. They certainly have a lot more name recognition than, obviously, Donald Trump. And if you look at the polling, of course, Donald Trump, you know, in the plus 40 and DeSantis dropped, but around 20 versus a Tim Scott in the single digits. So he's right on that front. But you're absolutely right, Kayleigh. I mean, this is general election politics. He's trying to make this case that he can beat Joe Biden, he can win purple states, and Donald Trump simply is unelectable in those purple states. The problem, though, is if he's going to make this case that Donald Trump is a loser, he has got to go on record saying Donald Trump lost 2020, and he still has not said that. So I am waiting for that when he announces next week.
In defense of Ron DeSantis with the real Jeannie Shanzano, please stand up. What's going on around here? Rick and Jeannie, thank you so much, as always, for the analysis and the insights. Our closers here. He's got a new nickname, you know. And by the way, we do expect a DeSantis announcement on Wednesday. Donald Trump out with a new ad today calling him Ron DeSales Tax.
Yeah.
So I guess we're still workshopping
It's
that.
a tough name when you're running against Donald Trump.
How true.
But we'll look forward to those announcements next week. First, though,
That's
Joe,
right.
we got to get through this weekend and see if the debt ceiling negotiators get back to the table in time for the president's return on Sunday.
Keep your eyes on the terminal Sunday. That could be very newsy. We'll be watching for that news conference. And we'll have a lot more for you back here on Monday on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.